So welcome to Mission Majjhima, Ajahn. Ajahn, so tell us about Majjhima 78, the Samanamuṇḍika Sutta.
So the Samanamuṇḍika Sutta finds us in Savatthi, in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery, which is where the Buddha spent many rains retreats. And we are oriented by the character of Pancakanga, a carpenter and a disciple of the Buddha, who actually we've met before in the Bahuvedaniya Sutta, a brilliant discourse or dialogue between him and another monk, and the Buddha's teaching afterwards. He wants to go see the Buddha, but decides it is not the right time to see the Blessed One. He's in retreat. And so he goes to Queen Mallika's park where there's philosophical debate. And there he finds Samanamuṇḍikāputta, Uggahamana is his clan's name, engaged in animal talk with a bunch of other wanderers. So talk of kings, ministers of states, robbers, politics, talk of the well, all the things we waste our breath on. And they see Pancakanga coming and say, look, a disciple of Gautama is coming. Such ones praise quiet, delight in quiet. Let us be quiet and maybe he will speak with us. Which is, as we've seen throughout this chapter of discourses with wanderers, is just something the Buddha's disciples were known for, is loving quiet. And what a beautiful invocation and thing to remember for us. So it works. Pancakanga comes, sits down, asks what he teaches, and Uggahamana says he says one is an invincible ascetic if they're endowed with four qualities. They don't engage in unwholesome speech, unwholesome action, don't have unwholesome intentions, and don't engage in wrong livelihood. Pancakanga decides not to pass judgment, but that he will consult the Blessed One about it, and a beautiful motion of heart in suspending judgment and consulting a teacher at appropriate time. He brings it up to the Buddha, and the Buddha says if that was the case, then even a newborn babe would be an invincible ascetic because they have no unwholesome speech and so on. So a bit of Buddhist humor. And he says, actually, I only say one is an invincible ascetic if one has 10 qualities. And then we have to wait the whole sutta before we find out what those are. But he says, first, one needs to understand these other four things. So unwholesome sila or habits, wholesome sila habits, unwholesome intention, and wholesome intention. And then he applies the framework of the Four Noble Truths to each of these, saying what they are, how they originate, how they fade, and the path to their cessation. So with unwholesome habits, he says, what are these? Unwholesome speech, bodily action, livelihood. Where do they originate? They originate in the mind affected by greed, hatred, delusion, the unwholesome roots, the akusala mula. Where do they cease? They cease through wholesome sila, wholesome habits, which is a very simple teaching, exchange the good for the bad. And that's how we change our hearts and our way of behaving. And then he says, what is the path? And it's the four right efforts. One arouses zeal and energy for the abandonment of unwholesome states, the cultivation of wholesome, basically, which is a categorical teaching the Buddha said was always applicable, these four right efforts of cultivating the wholesome, abandoning the unwholesome. Then he says, what are wholesome habits? They are right action, right speech, right livelihood. Where do they originate? In the mind, unaffected by the three unwholesome roots. Where do they cease? They cease, and this is fascinating, he says, wholesome habits cease in basically an arahant who behaves with virtue but does not identify, is not defined by that virtue. The word is silamaya, made by, and just this beautiful invocation of this idea that we can embody these things but without being defined by them. We use the Dharma as a raft, but we don't carry it, even though an arahant would behave with complete virtue. And then, once again, the path to that is the four right efforts. Then, so he's taken us above Uggahamana, beyond to an arahant. And then he goes down below and goes deeper. He says, what are the intentions that underlie these actions? And unwholesome intentions, the intention towards sensuality, ill will, cruelty. Where do these arise? They arise in the perception of sensuality, ill will, cruelty, which is fascinating that when we fixate on these perceptions, that's what gives rise to our intention. So where we turn our gaze turns into where we steer our action, basically, if we give too much attention unwholesomely. Where do they cease? They cease in the first jhana. That's fascinating. Unwholesome intentions cease because in the first jhana, these deep meditative states, only wholesome intentions remain. And the path to that cessation of unwholesome intention is the four right efforts. What are wholesome intentions? The opposites. Where do they arise? The perceptions of the opposites of, non-sensuality, non-ill will, non-cruelty. And where do they cease? The second jhana, which is fascinating. That's where vitakka vichara, directed thought and evaluation, still, and the mind is so calm, even unwholesome intentions have apparently faded. And fourth, the path is the four right efforts. And if one does all these things, the Buddha says that one is an invincible ascetic endowed with 10 qualities, which is the Noble Eightfold Path plus right knowledge and right vision. So these 10 qualities that an arahant is framed by. Yeah, beautiful discourse and a very interesting framing of the four right efforts. So what about you, Ajahn? What would you draw out of this discourse?
So about this character, Pancakanga, just a useful resource to let people know about is the Dictionary of Pali Proper Names, written by G.P. Malasekara, first printed in 1937-38, a 2-volume set, but a really fascinating book which goes into pretty much every proper name that you'll find in the canon. And Sutta Central has every word, every listing, every name in their database, in their dictionary, so you can just click on a name and see that person, more about that person. So Pancakanga, as we find in the sutta and others, Majjhima 59, Majjhima 126, is this carpenter, a white-robed, one of the Buddha's white-robed lay people. So reminiscent of what we're trying to start with at Clear Mountain, this Upasika program, which you find at Portland Friends of the Dhamma and elsewhere, of this pattern of wearing white robes. But Pancakanga, you find this in the commentaries, just an interesting point that he was one who had 5 tools, pancha angas, which were an adze, a chisel, a measuring stick, a hammer, and a chalk line. So interesting habits at the time of the Buddha. And then, so this is the third of 4 suttas where we find this pattern of wanderers talking in a park. We had Majjhima 76 with Sandaka and his friends talking all these topics of animal talk, and then the last one, 77, it was Sakudodai and his group, and now it's Uggahamana, and then the next sutta as well, we'll find the same pericope or stock phrase where a group is discussing these topics of animal talk. And it's useful really paying attention and looking at this list of 28 or so different topics of talk which is horizontal, tirachana, or perpendicular to the path. In other suttas in the Anguttara, the Buddha points to, rather than engaging in these 28 topics, which, as we mentioned last week, are kind of like YouTube, basically talk of kings, ministers, thieves, food, drink, etc. These really are what we waste a lot of time on, whether in conversation or in viewing or whatever it is. So rather than paying attention to these, talking about these things, watching these things nowadays, actually engaging in 10 topics of noble conversation, which are talk on fewness of wishes, talk on contentment, talk on seclusion, talk on non-entanglement, talk on arousing effort, on sila or virtue, on samadhi, on panya, so that's concentration and wisdom, and release, vimutti, and jnana, vimutti jnana dasana, so knowledge and vision of release. So talking, and if you're going to watch YouTube, see if you can watch YouTube about seclusion, or pay attention to things about contentment, fewness of wishes, minimalism. I think there's a lot of videos on that, but also virtue, etc. Act upon this metta, which leads to actions of metta, actions of renunciation, etc. So this is a great field of causality. So Ajahn, what is the word of the week?
The word of the week is sankappa, and that means intention, volition. It comes from the root kap, which means to think. And it's the second aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, samma sankappa, right intention. So may we all move into this week with right intention.
All right.